The green mountains of Vermont hold their secrets the way the seasons hold their cold, deep, patient, and long after everyone else has moved on. In the late autumn of 1998, the small township of Caledonia County, Vermont, population just under 9,000 souls at the time, became the kind of place that people outside of New England suddenly knew by name. Not because of its covered bridges, which still stand. Not because of its maple syrup farms, which still run in spring. But because of a young woman named Meredith Ann Colton, 31 years old, a part-time librarian and full-time mother of two, who walked out of her farmhouse on the morning of November 14, 1998, to hang laundry on the line in her backyard, and was never seen again. Her children, ages 4 and 6, were found seated at the kitchen table an hour and a half later by a neighbor who had stopped by to return a borrowed baking dish. The older child, a boy named Thomas, was still holding a crayon in his hand. The younger, a girl named Grace, was sitting very still, watching the back door. Meredith's husband, Daniel Colton, 40 years old, a timber contractor who worked across the county line, told investigators that morning that he had left the house before dawn. He said he had kissed his wife goodbye in the dark. He said she had been fine. He said everything had been fine. The laundry basket was found in the backyard, tipped on its side. A single white sheet lay in the frost-covered grass, half unfolded, like someone had set it down mid-task and simply stopped. The clothesline swayed in the November wind. The farmhouse sat quiet behind it. And the question that would consume an entire community for the next 24 years, the question that investigators wrote in notebooks and whispered in diners and carried home with them at the end of long shifts, was this: what happens to a woman who vanishes between the back door and the clothesline, 20 feet from where her children sat eating breakfast? And why does it take a quarter century to find out? Meredith Ann Colton was born Meredith Ann Hargrove in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, on March 4, 1967. She was the second of 3 children born to Robert and Louise Hargrove, her father a retired schoolteacher, her mother a bookkeeper for a small paper mill. Those who grew up alongside her in the community described her as someone who read constantly, who kept lists of books she wanted to finish, who had a habit of underlining sentences in pencil and writing small notes in the margins. She had studied literature at the University of Vermont, where she met Daniel Colton in her junior year. By 1998, she had been married for 8 years. She had 2 children, Thomas, 6, who had recently started first grade at Caledonia Elementary, and who loved drawing maps of imaginary countries, and Grace, 4, who was not yet in school and who spent most mornings following her mother around the house, carrying a small stuffed rabbit she called Rue. Meredith worked 3 mornings a week at the Caledonia County Public Library, cataloging donations and running the children's reading program on Tuesdays. Her colleagues there described her as warm, organized, and quietly funny. The kind of person who remembered the titles of books patrons had mentioned offhand, weeks later, and would set them aside. Her daily routine in November of 1998 was consistent. She would wake at 6:15, make coffee, pack Thomas's school bag, and get both children dressed before 7. Daniel typically left before 5 in the morning for work sites, which meant Meredith handled the mornings alone. On the days she worked at the library, her neighbor, a woman named Patricia Olds, would take Grace for the morning. On the days she did not work, Meredith ran the household, groceries, laundry, the small repairs that accumulated in older farmhouses, the school pickup in the afternoon. November 14, 1998 was a Saturday. The overnight temperature had dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and by morning the fields around the Colton property had acquired a thin white crust of frost. The sky, according to the weather records filed with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for that region and date, was overcast but dry, with southwest winds at 8 miles per hour. It was the kind of Vermont morning that smelled like wood smoke and cold air, the kind that asked you to work quickly if you intended to be outside. Meredith had done laundry the previous evening. According to the timeline reconstructed by investigators from later testimony, she had transferred the wet load from the washing machine to the laundry basket sometime around 8:15 on the morning of the 14th, after feeding the children breakfast. Thomas had been eating toast. Grace had been drawing on the back of an envelope with a red crayon. Meredith, according to Thomas's account given years later when he was old enough to be formally interviewed, had been wearing her green wool coat over her nightgown, something she often did for the brief trip to the backyard line. She kissed Grace on the top of the head. She picked up the basket. She went out the back door. The back door was a wooden frame door with a glass panel in the upper half. It opened onto a small concrete step, and from that step, a narrow flagstone path led approximately 20 feet through the yard to the clothesline, 2 parallel lines strung between a metal T-post and the corner post of the old barn. The barn had not been used for livestock in years and served primarily as storage for Daniel's work equipment. Thomas told investigators and later a child psychologist that he had heard the back door close. He had not heard it open again. At approximately 9:50 in the morning, Patricia Olds arrived at the Colton farmhouse to drop off a ceramic baking dish she had borrowed 3 weeks earlier for a community potluck. She knocked twice. No one answered. The front door was unlocked. She opened it, called out, and found the 2 children at the kitchen table. Thomas was drawing. Grace was looking at the back door. Patricia stepped inside, spoke to the children, looked out the back window, and saw the overturned basket and the white sheet lying in the frost. She called the Caledonia County Sheriff's Department at 9:58. The first deputy, a man named Carl Whitmore who had worked the county for 11 years, arrived at 10:14. He later wrote in his incident report, "Back door was standing slightly ajar. Laundry basket approximately 2 feet from base of clothesline on its side. 1 white bed sheet on ground, partially unfolded. No tracks visible in the frost beyond the stone path due to overnight wind redistribution. No signs of a struggle. Children calm but not communicative. Residents otherwise undisturbed." He noted something else in that initial report, a detail that would be read and reread over the following 2 decades. Barn door standing open approximately 3 inches. Noted but not entered on initial arrival. No lights visible inside. Daniel Colton was reached by phone at 10:41. He was on a work site 47 miles away in Orleans County. A colleague confirmed he had been present at the site since approximately 6:30 that morning. He arrived at the farmhouse at 12:02 in the afternoon. Deputy Whitmore, who was still on scene, later recorded his observations in a supplemental report filed that evening. Subject arrived calmly. Did not appear visibly distressed upon initial approach. Asked, "Did she go somewhere?" Rather than asking what had happened, expressed concern after being informed of circumstances. Did not ask to see the children immediately. The barn door had been open approximately 3 inches. The swing in the yard hung perfectly still. A small plastic toy truck, Thomas's, red, with a cracked front wheel lay on its side near the back step. The laundry basket sat tipped in the frost. And Meredith Ann Colton was not anywhere on the property, or in the surrounding fields, or on the road, or at any of the homes her husband or her neighbor or the arriving deputies could think to call. By the afternoon of November 14, 1998, the Caledonia County Sheriff's Department had been joined by 2 additional agencies, the Vermont State Police Missing Persons Unit and a volunteer search organization out of St. Johnsbury that had operated for several years and maintained its own trained searchers and canine units. By 4 in the afternoon, with less than 2 hours of usable daylight remaining, there were 43 people moving through the surrounding property, the fields behind the barn, the tree line to the north, the creek bed that ran along the property's eastern edge. The canine units worked from a piece of Meredith's clothing, a wool sweater taken from a hook inside the back door. The dogs moved with purpose toward the north tree line, then lost the trail near a logging road that bisected the forest approximately 3/4 of a mile from the house. The logging road was soft with recent tire passage, but offered no clean tracks. It connected, at its eastern end, to a county route that ran 40 miles through the county before joining a state highway. No physical trace of Meredith was found that day, or the next, or in the weeks of organized searching that followed. The community of Caledonia County and Vermont communities know how to show up for their own, responded in the way such communities have always responded in the years before social media made the response global and therefore, perhaps, thinner. Handmade signs appeared on bulletin boards at the general store, at the library, at the 2 churches on the main road. The Rotary Club organized a second search in the 3rd week of November. A local radio station ran daily updates. Neighbors dropped off casseroles. Women from the library organized childcare rotations for Thomas and Grace so that Daniel would be free to, as people said at the time, do whatever he needed to do. What Daniel Colton needed to do, according to later testimony from several people who were present during those weeks, was difficult to characterize clearly. Those who knew him said he seemed composed in a way that fell just outside the range of what most people expected. He attended the organized searches, but was described by multiple volunteers as present but not searching, walking the lines, staying visible, but not pushing through brush or calling her name with any urgency. He spoke to local media twice in the first week, delivering brief, measured statements. In neither appearance did he cry. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves that Daniel Colton's composure was worth noting. Not damning, worth noting. The Vermont State Police assigned Detective Sergeant Anne-Marie Prudhomme to the case in the 2nd week. Prudhomme, a 17-year veteran of the state police, had worked 3 prior missing persons cases involving family members as eventual persons of interest. She later described her initial impression of Daniel Colton in testimony. He answered every question without hesitation. In my experience, when someone answers every question without hesitation, one of 2 things is true. Either they have nothing to hide or they have rehearsed. The timeline discrepancies were small, but they accumulated. Daniel said he had left the house at approximately 4:50 in the morning. His work colleague, Raymond Taft, said Daniel had arrived at the Orleans County site at approximately 6:30. The drive between the Colton farmhouse and the work site, under normal conditions on the roads involved, took approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes. 4:50 departure to 6:30 arrival was 1 hour and 40 minutes, plausible, but 10 minutes longer than the route required. On secondary roads in pre-dawn November darkness, with possible stops for fuel, investigators initially found the gap unremarkable. Then a gas station attendant in the town of Barton, 42 miles from the Colton farmhouse, not on the most direct route to the Orleans County work site, provided a statement in the 3rd week of the investigation. He believed he had seen a truck matching Daniel's description at the station between 5:15 and 5:30 on the morning of November 14th. He could not confirm the plate. He said the driver had not come inside. He had seen the vehicle from the window of the attendant's booth and noted it only because it had pulled in and then pulled back out without stopping at a pump. That observation placed Daniel Colton, possibly, on a route that diverged from the direct path to his work site. The town of Barton was 12 miles from the logging road where the search dogs had lost Meredith's trail. Detective Prudhomme noted this in her case file. She requested subpoenas for Daniel's cell phone records and bank account activity. The phone records showed no activity between 4:42 in the morning and 6:58, when he received a call from a subcontractor. The gap was consistent with either an uneventful early morning drive or with a period during which the phone had been deliberately left off. The physical evidence collected from the Colton farmhouse and property, cataloged across 3 separate forensic visits, was as follows. The laundry basket, examined for fingerprints and trace material. The white sheet, examined for biological material, soil transfer and fiber. The barn interior, searched and photographed. The logging road, photographed and measured. No biological material attributable to violence was found on the sheet or the basket. The barn yielded equipment consistent with Daniel's contracting work: saws, cords, a truck bed liner, fuel cans, and a quantity of dark soil on the floor near the far wall that forensic technicians collected and documented, but could not, at that stage, connect to anything specific. In December of 1998, with the ground frozen and search conditions increasingly difficult, the organized operations were suspended. The case was classified as an open missing persons investigation. The barn door had been standing open 3 inches. The logging road had held tire tracks. The search dogs had moved toward the north tree line and stopped. Small details. The kind that sit in a case file for years and mean nothing until they mean everything. Daniel Colton was never formally named a suspect in 1998. There was not enough. Detective Prudhomme wrote at the close of her initial case summary, "Subject remains a person of interest. Timeline inconsistencies noted but not resolved. Physical evidence insufficient at this time for further action. Case to remain open pending new information." The file was assigned a cold case number. It sat. In February of 1999, Daniel Colton sold the farmhouse. He moved with Thomas and Grace to a rented house in Hardwick, the next county over, approximately 35 miles southwest of the original property. He enrolled Thomas in a new school. He arranged for a woman from the church he had joined, a woman named Carol, who was in her 60s and had raised 4 children of her own, to watch Grace during his work hours. He did not, according to those who knew him during this period, speak often about Meredith. When neighbors or acquaintances asked, he said the same thing each time: "We're waiting for news." For those who have ever doubted someone they love, who have felt the cold, slow creep of a question they couldn't bring themselves to ask, the silence that settled over the Colton household in Hardwick in 1999 will carry a recognizable weight. Thomas, now 7, had begun drawing obsessively. He drew houses, always the same house, with a flat roof and a clothesline in the back. He drew it in school notebooks. He drew it on the backs of grocery bags. His first-grade teacher in Hardwick, a woman named Mrs. Ellen Broussard, mentioned the drawings to Daniel at a parent-teacher conference in March of 1999. She described Daniel's response in a statement she gave many years later. "He looked at the drawing for a very long time without saying anything. Then he folded it in half and put it in his coat pocket. He thanked me for mentioning it. He didn't say anything else." Grace, who turned 5 in the spring of 1999, had stopped carrying the stuffed rabbit she called Rue, and had, according to Carol the churchwoman, placed it on a shelf in her bedroom where she could see it from her bed. She did not play with it. She did not, Carol noted, ask her father for it. She watched it. The psychological weight of a disappeared parent on young children is not measurable in the conventional sense. It is visible in the drawings. It is visible in the watching. In the fall of 1999, Daniel Colton began a relationship with a woman named Sandra Ewell, who worked in the billing department of the hospital in St. Johnsbury. Those who knew both of them described it as quiet and tentative at first, two people who had each experienced loss, who moved carefully around each other. Some in the community who had known Meredith and Daniel expressed discomfort at the speed of the new relationship. Others defended him. Both positions were comprehensible. Meredith had been missing for less than a year. Detective Prudhomme checked in on the case twice in 1999 and once in 2000. There was nothing new. The gas station attendant from Barton had moved out of Vermont by then. The dark soil from the barn had been sent to a state lab and returned with a determination of common agricultural composition, non-distinctive. The logging road had been used repeatedly by timber operations in the intervening months and offered nothing further. The cell phone records had yielded their gap and nothing more. In 2001, Daniel Colton married Sandra Ewell in a small ceremony at the Hardwick Church. Thomas was 9, Grace was 7. According to a woman who attended and who was interviewed as part of a later investigation, Thomas sat through the ceremony without expression. Grace cried not at the ceremony itself, but in the parking lot afterward quietly against the side of the car when she thought no one was watching. A woman noticed. She said nothing. Clears throat. The years after that followed the quiet arithmetic of a household trying to function. Daniel's contracting business expanded. Sandra was, by all accounts, a steady and attentive presence for the children. Thomas became an athlete, cross-country running, then track. Grace became an artist, then a student of art. Outwardly, the household in Hardwick reflected a family that had rebuilt. But for those who have ever noticed the thing that doesn't fit, the pause before the answer, the room that no one decorates, the photograph that isn't displayed anywhere. The Colton household held something that visiting casserole-bearing neighbors couldn't name. Daniel and Sandra's marriage, which had appeared stable through the middle years of the 2000s, began showing strain around 2010. According to Sandra's later statement to investigators, the tension was not dramatic in its origins. It was the kind that accumulates from years of unspoken things. She said that Daniel did not discuss Meredith with her. She said that when the children's names for their first mother came up, when a school assignment required family history, when a doctor's form asked about maternal medical background, Daniel would become very still and very brief, and the subject would close. She said she had learned not to press. She said she had learned to live alongside a door that was always shut. In 2013, Thomas Colton, then 21 years old and a junior at a Vermont State University, drove back to Caledonia County on a Saturday in October. He drove to the property where the farmhouse had stood. A new family had owned it since 2003 and had renovated substantially. The clothesline was gone. The old barn had been torn down and replaced with a new prefabricated structure. The flagstone path had been repaved. Thomas sat in his car at the end of the gravel drive for approximately 20 minutes, according to his own account given later. Then he drove away. He did not tell his father he had gone. In 2015, Sandra Ewell Colton filed for legal separation from Daniel. She moved to Burlington. In her statement to the court, she cited irreconcilable distance. Grace, by then 21, moved with her. Thomas was already living independently. Daniel remained in the Hardwick house alone. The swing had long since been removed. The toy truck was gone. The house in Hardwick held a man with a shut door and 2 adult children who visited less frequently each year. The case file sat in the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit, boxes of it, organized, labeled, waiting. Then Grace painted something. In the fall of 2019, Grace Colton, 25 years old, pursuing a graduate degree in fine arts at the University of Vermont, completed a series of paintings as part of her thesis exhibition. The series, which she titled simply November, depicted a backyard, a clothesline, an overturned basket, and a green wool coat lying in frost-covered grass. Gallery visitors who saw the exhibition and who knew nothing about the Colton case described the work as haunting, formally accomplished, emotionally overwhelming, full of a specific grief that felt documentary in its precision. One visitor who attended the opening reception was a woman named Dr. Teresa Malone, a forensic psychologist who consulted with the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit. She knew the Colton name. She knew the case number. She stood in front of Grace's paintings for a long time. She made a call the next morning. The call Dr. Malone made was to Detective Lieutenant Raymond Goss, who had inherited the Colton cold case file when Anne Marie Prudhomme retired from the Vermont State Police in 2011. Goss was 53 years old, a methodical man who had spent the better part of his career working cases that other people had set aside. He had read the Colton file 3 times. He had noted the same things Prudhomme had noted: the timeline gap, the Barton gas station, the barn door standing 3 inches open, the dark soil on the barn floor. He had also noted something that Prudhomme had flagged in a late addendum to her case summary, written in 2003 after a conversation with a retired forensic geologist. The dark soil sample from the barn, while agriculturally common in composition, had contained trace amounts of a particular clay mineral profile consistent with the creek bed on the eastern edge of the Colton property. The same creek bed that search teams had walked in 1998. Goss had sent a supplemental soil request to the state lab in 2012, asking for a comparison analysis between the archived barn sample and new samples taken from the creek bed. The lab had completed the analysis in 2013. The mineral profiles were consistent. He had noted it. He had not been able to act on it alone. Now, in October of 2019, Dr. Malone was telling him about a young woman's paintings, and Goss drove to Burlington and sat in a coffee shop with Grace Colton for 2 hours on a Thursday morning in late October. Clears throat. Grace Colton had not been formally interviewed by law enforcement since a brief, incomplete session conducted when she was 11 years old. She had been 4 years old on November 14, 1998. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, watching the back door, when Patricia Olds had arrived with the baking dish. In that 2008 interview, conducted as part of a routine case status review, she had said she did not remember the morning clearly. She had said she remembered her mother's green coat. She had said she remembered the rabbit. In the coffee shop in Burlington in 2019, Grace Colton told Detective Lieutenant Goss something she had not told anyone. She said that as an adult, and through the process of creating the paintings in her thesis series, she had accessed a memory she had not previously been able to fully form. She said the memory was of standing at the back window of the kitchen, not sitting at the table, but having gotten up from the table and gone to the window, the way children do when something catches them. She said she remembered seeing her father's truck in the yard. She said it had been there when her mother went out with the laundry basket. She said she had not understood this as a child, had not known her father's truck was not supposed to be there, had not had the framework to file it as information. She was 4 years old. She said, according to Goss's notes from that meeting, "I thought he had forgotten something. I thought he came back to get something he forgot. I didn't know then that he was supposed to be 47 miles away." Goss returned to the case file with this and with something additional, something that Grace had shared only at the end of their meeting quietly, with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. She told him that in 2009, when she was 15, she had found a box in the back of a closet in the Hardwick house. She had opened it, as 15-year-olds do, because it was there, and because she was looking for something else entirely. Inside the box, she had found her mother's library card. Her mother's reading lists, the handwritten ones with books underlined. Her mother's watch. She had replaced everything, closed the box, and not spoken of it to anyone for 10 years. She said, "I told myself there was a normal reason. I told myself that for a long time." On November 3rd, 2019, Detective Lieutenant Goss filed for and received a search warrant for the property of Daniel Arthur Colton in Hardwick, Vermont. He also filed for a warrant to search a 1,200-square-foot parcel of land along the creek bed on the eastern edge of the original Caledonia County farmhouse property, which was now owned by the current farmhouse residents, but included in the warrant on the basis of the soil analysis and the historical search dog behavior from 1998. The search of the Hardwick house yielded the box from the closet, exactly where Grace had described it, behind a stack of folded blankets on the upper shelf of the bedroom wardrobe. Inside were Meredith Ann Colton's library card, 3 handwritten reading lists, and a small stainless steel women's watch with a cracked crystal. The watch was sent to the state lab for biological trace analysis. The search of the creek bed parcel began on November 7, 2019, with a cadaver search team and ground-penetrating radar equipment. The Vermont State Police forensic team, working with a consulting forensic archaeologist named Dr. Patricia Fuentes from the University of Vermont, identified an area of subsurface disturbance approximately 40 yards north of the creek bank, in a section of the forest that sat between the tree line and the old logging road. The same logging road where the search dogs had lost the trail in November of 1998. The excavation took 4 days. On November 11, 2019, 21 years and 3 days after the morning, Meredith Colton had walked out her back door with a laundry basket. The remains of a woman were recovered from a depth of approximately 4 feet below the surface. Clear's throat. The formal identification, completed through dental records and mitochondrial DNA analysis, was confirmed on December 2, 2019. The remains were those of Meredith Ann Colton. The medical examiner's findings, released in a summary report in February of 2020 after complete analysis, concluded that the manner of death was consistent with homicidal violence. Specific forensic details were held under seal pending prosecution. The report noted that the depth and circumstances of the internment were consistent with deliberate concealment rather than natural deposition. On December 14, 2019, a Saturday, 21 years to the month after the original report had been filed, Daniel Arthur Colton was arrested at his home in Hardwick, Vermont, by Vermont State Police officers accompanied by Detective Lieutenant Goss. According to Goss's arrest report, Daniel Colton was standing in his kitchen when officers arrived at 7:48 in the morning. He was wearing a flannel shirt and holding a coffee mug. When Goss read the arrest warrant to him, for the charge of second-degree unlawful homicide in the death of Meredith Ann Colton, Daniel Colton said nothing for a period of approximately 12 seconds. Then he set down the coffee mug on the counter very carefully and said, "I want to call my attorney." He did not ask how they had found her. The arrest was covered within hours by Vermont Public Radio, then by regional network affiliates, then by national media organizations that had maintained background files on the cold case from years of periodic updates. The story moved quickly. By evening, the Caledonia County coverage had been picked up by outlets in Boston, New York, and beyond. The framing was consistent: A 21-year cold case, solved. A suspect no one outside law enforcement had publicly named. A community now asked to reckon with what it had or had not seen. The community's response was divided, not cleanly but authentically. Patricia Olds, the neighbor who had arrived with the baking dish on the morning of November 14, 1998, and who was now in her late 70s, gave a brief statement to a local reporter. She said, "I thought about those children sitting at that table for 20 years. I thought about that back door standing open. I always thought something was wrong, but thinking something is wrong and knowing something are two very different things." A colleague from Daniel's contracting business of many years, a man who had worked alongside him through the 1990s and into the 2000s, declined to give his name but told a reporter outside the courthouse, "I don't believe it. I've worked with that man for 15 years. That's not the man I know." He paused. He added, "But I said that about his schedule once too, and I was wrong about that." Those who had known Meredith, her colleagues at the library, her former neighbors in Caledonia County, the women who had run the childcare rotation in those first weeks of searching, gathered, without planning to, at the Caledonia County Public Library on the evening of December 14th. A librarian who had known Meredith well placed a copy of one of her reading lists, reproduced, not the original, which was held as evidence, on the community bulletin board beside the front entrance. Beside it, someone tacked a small photograph. Meredith at the library's summer reading program, standing in front of a display of books, laughing at something outside the frame. The photograph had been taken in the summer of 1997, approximately 14 months before she disappeared. Thomas Colton, 27 years old at the time of the arrest, released a written statement through a victim's advocate who had been in contact with him since the excavation. The statement read in part, "We have waited for a long time. We are grateful to the investigators who kept this case open and who did not stop asking questions. We ask for privacy as we find our way through this." He did not mention his father. Grace Colton made no public statement. She returned in the days after the arrest to her studio at the university. Those who knew her said she painted constantly for 2 weeks. She did not exhibit what she made. She kept it. The trial of Daniel Arthur Colton commenced in Burlington, Vermont, in March of 2022, following a period of extensive pretrial motions, forensic depositions, and the resolution of several evidentiary hearings. The prosecution presented a case built on layered circumstantial architecture, the timeline discrepancies from 1998, the gas station sighting in Barton, the soil analysis linking the barn floor to the creek bed burial site, the box of personal effects found in the Hardwick wardrobe, Grace's testimony about the truck in the yard and the items in the closet, the forensic evidence recovered with the remains. And critically, cell tower data subpoenaed as part of the 2019 investigation, data that placed Daniel Colton's phone in the vicinity of the Caledonia County logging road at 5:17 in the morning on November 14, 1998. 5:17 in the morning, the logging road, 12 miles from where the search dogs had stopped. The defense argued that cell tower data from 1998 was too imprecise to constitute reliable placement evidence, that the box of personal effects reflected grief and not guilt, and that 21 years of circumstantial accumulation did not constitute proof beyond the legal standard required for conviction. Defense counsel, in closing arguments, said, "A man who misses his wife keeps things that belong to her. A man who loved her remembers where he was that morning. What you are being asked to do here is convict a man based on a child's recovered memory, a gas station attendant who wasn't certain, and soil that could have been carried in on a boot." The jury deliberated for 6 days. On April 19, 2022, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of second-degree unlawful homicide. Daniel Arthur Colton, 64 years old, stood at the defense table and received the verdict with the same stillness that Carl Whitmore had noted in a supplemental report filed on the evening of November 14, 1998. He did not speak. He did not look at the gallery. He looked at a point somewhere between the judge's bench and the floor, and he stood very still. In the gallery, Patricia Olds closed her eyes. One of Meredith's library colleagues pressed a hand to her mouth. The women who had once organized the childcare rotation, those who were still in the county, those who had been reachable when the verdict came, sat together in 2 rows and were very quiet. Thomas Colton had not attended the trial in person. Grace Colton had attended 4 days of testimony, sitting in the second row of the gallery with the victim's advocate beside her. On the day of the verdict, she sat in the same seat. When the guilty verdict was read, she did not cry. She placed both hands flat on her thighs and she looked forward and she breathed. Detective Lieutenant Raymond Goss, standing near the back of the courtroom, watched the jury file out and said nothing. He had driven to Burlington that morning from Montpelier, where he lived, and he would drive back that evening. He had done this for 32 days of trial. He would later, in an interview given to a Vermont public radio journalist in the summer of 2022, describe what it had meant to work a case for 8 years and finally stand in a courtroom for the verdict. He said, "The thing about cold cases is that every year the case gets colder, the truth stays exactly the same temperature. It doesn't age. It doesn't change. It just waits." He paused, he said, "She waited." Clears throat. Sentencing took place in July of 2022. Daniel Arthur Colton was sentenced to 35 years to life in the Vermont Department of Corrections. He was remanded immediately. He exited the courtroom through a side door. The gallery sat with the sound of it. The Caledonia County Public Library expanded its children's reading program in 2023. The program is named for Meredith Ann Colton. On a Tuesday morning in October of that year, the kind of Vermont morning that smells like wood smoke and cold air, the kind that asks you to work quickly if you intend to be outside, a group of small children sat on a rug in the library's back room and listened to a librarian read aloud from a picture book. The light through the windows was the particular low gold of New England autumn. On the wall beside the bookshelves was a small framed photograph, Meredith at the summer reading display, laughing at something outside the frame. For those who have ever sat with an unanswered question for years, who have held the weight of something unresolved and carried it forward, and refused to set it down entirely, the answer, when it finally comes, does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives the way Anne-Marie Prudhomme described it in a statement she gave after the verdict from her home in St. Johnsbury, where she had retired with her husband and her garden. It arrived like the end of a very long winter. You knew it had to come. You had kept telling yourself it had to come, and then one morning you looked outside and the ground was thawed. Clears throat. Grace Colton completed her graduate degree in 2020. She teaches art in Burlington. She still paints in November. Thomas Colton runs cross-country trails on weekend mornings in whatever county he lives in. He has not publicly discussed his father. He has not had to. Meredith Ann Colton, who loved books and kept reading lists and taught children at a library in Vermont, and kissed her daughter on the top of the head before picking up a laundry basket on a cold Saturday morning in 1998, was 41 years old when she was found, or would have been, if time had kept going for her the way it kept going for everyone else. The clothesline in the backyard is long since gone, but the truth, as Detective Goss said, stayed the same temperature the entire time. She deserved to be found. She deserved to be remembered. She was both.